president of Taiwan went to his alma mater in Cornell, and it led to an immediate escalation of conflict across the Taiwan Straits. Would that happen today? China and Taiwan seem to be making their own accommodation, but yet it's a sensitive issue.
You know, I don't think so. That was a big problem when I normalized relations with China, was what to do with Taiwan. Because we did have a treaty that had a one-year notice before either one withdrew, and I had to wait a year. And it took about that long to get legislation to Congress to let us continue to trade and have commerce with Taiwan without diplomatic relations. So I think that what's happened in the last Taiwanese election was that the Taiwanese people chose a leader that made it clear that he would try to get along harmoniously with China. And I think that exchange of tourism and investments back and forth has helped to ensure that we won't have a mistake made in the future that would cause some military conflict between China on the mainland and Taiwan. If that happened, there would be tremendous political pressure on the American government to intercede, which I think would be a tragic situation. But I remember in the days of John Kennedy, when he was debating on television with Nixon, one of the main things was Quemoy and Matsu, two little tiny islands between Taiwan and China. It was the #1 international military issue between Nixon and Kennedy. Well, I think that my normalization and my commitment that we would continue to deal with Taiwan every way except diplomatically, and at the same time recognize that Taiwan was part of China, which confirmed what Nixon said, was a premise or a formula that can survive in the future.
And to add on to Mary's point, to keep this theme a little bit about how we avoid misunderstandings, President Obama has got to hold 60 votes in the Senate in order to pass health care. And there are a lot of Democratic senators who don't like this trade issue with China, who want to see protection, who want to see tires. Can a U.S. president manage this relationship under these circumstances? And is there a danger that the Chinese would miscalculate our actions in that regard, which are really driven by the concern about health care?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Well,
not talking to myself.
Well, the main thing we are insisting on now for China economically is that they increase the value of their currency, the yuan. As you probably know, the Chinese decided in the past to tie their currency value to the U.S. dollar. And lately, the U.S. dollar has gone down compared to all other currencies, and that means that the yuan has also gone down in value when most unbiased economists in the world are sure that the yuan is undervalued. And this cheap currency in China means that China can sell their products abroad much easier than they can buy foreign products for themselves. And since we have an enormous negative trade balance with China, we buy much more from China than we sell them. It kind of aggravates that problem. But it's a sovereign country. And I think we have just about as much chance of forcing the Chinese to change the value of their currency as the Chinese have the right or authority to tell the U.S. Congress what to do about some issue that concerns them. I think China will continue to make their own decision. And if they do increase the value of the yuan, it'll be because of their own domestic considerations and not pressure from the United States.
Now, would you agree?
I want to actually go back to the war issue that President Carter mentioned. Deng Xiaoping is really smart because when he came over here, he already made the decision to invade Vietnam, but he wanted to come over here to show that there is solidarity between the United States and China, so that Moscow could not really act. I wrote one of the papers when I was at Emory, but that's not my point. My point is the treacherousness of ideology. Vietnam and China and Soviet Union used to share the same ideology. It didn't prevent them from going into conflict, even to fight a war. China and the United States don't share the same ideology. However, that doesn't prevent the two countries from coming together. But still, the ideology, as Mary mentioned, this fear of China actually has a lot to do with American people believe American exceptionalism, that American way of life is the way of life and China has to follow. And China, of course, more and more aggressive in saying, there is no American way of life. We have to follow. We have our exceptional, Chinese exceptionalism. So people say that's, Washington consensus versus Beijing consensus. I guess the key here is to find common ground so that the two consensus can get closer to each other. Otherwise, I think that fear is going to be there. It will become a very huge hurdle in terms of dealing with the bilateral relationship.
One of the questions I get quite often is about how human rights have changed in China in the last 30 years. And I think there's been a tremendous improvement. There's still some problems in both countries. But when Rosa and I visited China in 1981, for instance, it was impossible for a Chinese family to move from one village to another without getting permission in advance. And there was zero opportunity for a family to earn a profit and keep the money. And when Deng Xiaoping came over here in 1979, he asked me one of the most intriguing questions at the state banquet. He said, "You've done a lot to help China. Is there anything I can do for you personally?" And I said, "Yes, there is, as a matter of fact. When I was a little child, the heroes in my life were Baptist missionaries to China. And I used to give a nickel a week to help build hospitals and schools for Chinese children. And now you don't permit freedom of worship, and you don't permit Bibles, and you don't permit missionaries. And my request to you is that you do those three things." He said, "I'll have to think about that." So the next morning we had breakfast together. He said, I've decided to honor two of your requests. We'll guarantee freedom of worship in China, which they did in 1982 at the National People's Congress. And we'll immediately authorize the distribution of Bibles. So when Rosa and I went to China in August of '81, we visited some churches to see if he kept his promise, and they were very proud of their new Bibles. And we visited an Anglican church in Shanghai, and they said that the publisher of the Bible had run out of special paper, the thin paper, and Deng Xiaoping had got the special paper for them. And the fact is that since then, religious freedom has paid off in an incredible way. There are still some restraints. The last time I met with Hu Jintao, the premier, I asked him to remove the requirement that churches have to register with the government. And I hope that someday China will do that. But even the churches that don't register are not harassed under special circumstances. But this past January, a Catholic magazine stated that there were 100,000 new Christians in China every day. And if you figure out the percentage, that's just one person for every 100,000 people. But they also estimated that within 10 years, China will have more Christians than any other nation on earth. Now China is third, behind the United States and Brazil. But China's conversion of Chinese people to Christianity is the most rapid on earth now. And so that's another indication, in my opinion, of how human rights have changed in China. And the guarantee of freedom of worship is not just to Christians. That's not just to Protestants. It's to Muslims and people who worship in different ways. So I think that's another indication of improvement in China.
Well, that's very helpful, and it complements a card I was just handed with a question that you and Yahweh might be able to address.